Hi guys, this is Mrs. Brand. We are ready to look at the Unbreakable Code, your story for this week. It is historical fiction, and your story takes place in the Southwest. And as far as when it takes place, the flashback that we're going to hear about and talk about happens during World War II, and it's talking about the Navajo tribe. So we have those historical fiction or the historical pieces there, and let's get on into this little story here. So John is the boy in this picture, and John is running, and he's trying to get away and hide from someone. Do you remember who that was? Well, he was trying to hide, hopefully you said, from his mom and this man that she married from Minnesota. Okay, so they were going to go there and move there for a while, and then they'd be back in the summers. And so he's hiding, and all of a sudden he hears a voice. And who is it that he hears? He hears his grandfather. And his grandfather says that he really should, that he'll be fine. The boy, John, is worried about going to a new school and starting things there, and Grandpa reassures him he's going to be fine because he has the Unbreakable Code, and he doesn't know what that is. So the grandfather started speaking in Navajo, and then he talks to him about what the Unbreakable Code is. It saved his life in World War II. When grandfather was younger, he went to this government boarding school when he was 5. It was the law. They had to go to these boarding schools when they were 5. And if they spoke the language, they had to chew on a bar of soap or squares of soap. And they wanted to get them to be more Americanized, if you will, and stop being like their tribe. And so they were told not to speak the language. And when he was there, when he was in 10th grade, so when you're in 10th grade, you're about 15 years old, maybe 16, depending on when your birthday is. And he heard this bulletin on the radio, this little news bulletin, this informational piece, that they were looking for people between the age of 17 and 32 that could speak English and Navajo and that were in good condition. And he decided to sneak out of this place, this school that he was at, and he decided to enlist. And then there was no records there's no birth certificates that says what his age was. So he, 2 weeks later, went to boot camp with 28 other Navajos. And he had left this area that he had been in his entire life. And he was scared, but they were a great platoon. And part of that had to do with the fact that when they were at boarding school, they did a lot of drills and hiking and walking and marching and that type of thing. So it was no big deal. It had been something he had been doing for a long time. And they had all gone without food for a few days. And so they learned how to survive. And so they started their time at boot camp, and they were not allowed to talk to their families or anybody. And they they had been put in this old school, and they were locked in a classroom at the end of this corridor. And they said it was a top secret thing. They couldn't tell anybody, couldn't talk to anybody about it. And the Japanese had been intercepting and decoding all the American messages that were being sent. And so the government thought, well, the Navajo language might be able to be a way that they could send messages to the American troops and not have it discovered at all. And the reason that they thought this was because the language had never been written down. It was just a spoken language that was spoken from person to person, and you learned it that way. So there was no alphabet for the Japanese to discover and decode. And so they gave them lists of codes, or of military words, and they wanted them to make code words for these things. And it was kind of funny because all their life, since he was 5, he was told to forget the language, and now the government wanted them to use the language and use it a lot. So they would go back and they would start learning or making up words for the alphabet. And so A became Walachi. And even here, John says in English, ant. And then he says B was shush. And bear is what he says in English. So you can tell that John knows the Navajo language that his grandpa's talking about here. And he goes through the whole alphabet, tells them all about it. And then they would test each other at night and things like that. And then they had the Japanese would fight at night, so they would have to learn how to do their work in complete darkness. And so they had blindfolds on them and made them do things with blindfolds on them so that they were ready for that time. Okay? And he had a message that he received, and he spoke it into the microphone in Navajo, and then they ran to see, they were testing it to see if it worked. And sure enough, it would work, and they tested it over and over again to make sure they were successful. And then 2 groups stayed behind to train all the rest, or to train people, and the rest were all sent over for to help in the military here. And when he looks at this whole thing, there's a beautiful island, and it's all being burnt up and bombed and everything like this. He had a problem where he almost died just as he's trying to get onto the beach. And he had to step over people, and he couldn't even stop. He couldn't even say he's sorry. He just had to run over them and get to where he had to be. And he would set up things, and then he would have to send the messages all over the place. And he had a problem where somebody thought that he was not an actual soldier, that he had stolen a uniform, and his eyes and his hair looked like the Japanese, so they thought he was a Japanese who had stolen the uniform. And then somebody jumped out, a friend of his, and saved his life. And he says that his belief was his shield the rest of the time, that his belief was what got him through this difficult time. And he talks about only a few of them survived in World War II. The code men. And the Japanese didn't crack the code, and it was pretty cool that way. There was he talks about a situation where somebody was tortured because they thought he knew code and he didn't know code. And then this paragraph right here: 6 months before the war ended, Navajo code talkers passed more than 800 messages in 2 days during the invasion of Iwo Jima. And then here's the iconic raising of the flag on top of the mountain of Iwo Jima. It was a very big celebration at that time to be able to put that up there. And then he thought there would be this, welcoming homecoming thing, and there wasn't, because he wasn't allowed to tell anyone about the code. So when he came home, it was just, there was no parades, no parties, no welcome back, no great job, because he wasn't, all the Navajos were not allowed to talk about what happened and what they did. And John is inquisitive, and he asks the question, well, why did you leave to begin with then? He talks about this idea that the code name for America was Our Mother. And you fight for what you love. You fight for your country because it's what you love. And that's why he did it, because he wanted to fight for America and the country that he loves. And he gives him his grandson a wallet, and the one that he was given, the one that he had that carried the corn pollen from the medicine man. And the medicine man had said, don't be afraid, nothing's going to touch you, that type of thing. And he kept that with him, and then that he passed on to his grandson then. And then his grandson, he went from wanting to hide and not go to Minnesota at the beginning to being not scared to go to a new place at the end. And, he realizes he's the grandson of a Navajo code talker that helped save the country. And pretty exciting time for him then. And also a great backstory for us to learn more about the code talkers in the Unbreakable Code that saved our country. So that is your story for today, or for this week. And I want to just remind you that you can go back onto your website and you can go and look at your vocabulary words: bulletin, contributions, diversity, enlisted, intercept, operations, recruits, and survival. Okay? Go back there, go over words that you have here. Intercept. And they even have the little, the little thing that can speak to you and give you a little, little audio there for some of it. You click on the routine, it'll give you your definition, it'll give you your example and your ask and answer question parts. And you can do that right there on your website under the vocab tab, the second little circle that you can click on. Okay, so that's your story, the Unbreakable Code for this week, and I hope you do great on your tests. Have a great weekend after you're done with your tests.